Welcome to this special episode of Conversations at Care. Professor Adrian Hill, welcome on the show.
Thank you.
You've been at the forefront of malaria vaccine development for decades. What makes malaria such a persistent challenge despite decades of research and intervention?
We think there are several things that has made malaria a particularly difficult disease to vaccinate against. Firstly, it's been around for an immensely long time, not just thousands of years where we have historical records of classical times and malarious areas in the Mediterranean and so on, but we can now analyze the parasite's own genome and understand how old that parasite is, and the answer is about 30 or more million years. So this parasite has been around, infecting people long before we were fully fledged humans. So our ancestors, tens of millions of years ago, were probably troubled by malaria. And of course, in historical times, we have records of malaria killing huge numbers of people.
Professor Hill, your team's work on the R21 matrix M vaccine has shown promising results. How close are we to scalable, accessible malaria vaccine for children across sub-Saharan Africa?
We are certainly most of the way there. We have two vaccines, one of them developed in Oxford, one of them by a pharmaceutical company, GSK, that are now being distributed in Africa. And this year there might be about 100 million doses distributed in 2025 of the main malaria vaccine called R21. R21 is a traditional vaccine in that it's made of a protein from the microbe, in this case the malaria parasite. We manufacture it at scale with our partners in India, who have literally the world's largest vaccine manufacturing facility. They're aiming for about 100 million doses this year, more next year, because actually there are huge numbers of African children to protect. Now, why African children? Because there's more malaria still in Africa than anywhere else. Most of the people who die from malaria in Africa are young children. Yes, some adults can die. For example, pregnant women are at particular risk, but around about 90% of the deaths in the world each year are children growing up in Africa. So that 500,000 or so deaths is something we really think we can now reduce down maybe to the tens of thousands fairly quickly if we can distribute vaccines very efficiently and make sure that we can manage to pay for manufacturing them.
Crystal clear, thank you. Dr. Hill, what role does genomic research and human genetics play in understanding susceptibility to malaria, and how could that impact future vaccine strategies?
There's been a great deal of research on the human genome and the malaria parasite, and what's clear is that some of the genes that we find widely in the world, particularly in Africa, have almost certainly been caused by malaria because they provide resistance to malaria, which is a really useful thing. Sickle hemoglobin is well known as an example, changing the type of blood inside our red cells so that it's harder for the parasites to grow inside red cells. And that's what malaria parasites need to do. There are many other examples, from the thalassemias to various enzyme deficiencies, that are very prevalent again in Africa, not in northern countries. And again, we have good evidence that they have been protecting to some degree against death from malaria. So that's a fascinating insight into the evolution of resistance to malaria parasites in people, and that has helped us understand the molecular details of how we interact with this very long-standing parasitic disease.
Awesome. Professor Hill, this year's course also explores the integration of AI into vaccine development. In your point of view, how can AI accelerate progress in malaria prevention, particularly in identifying new antigen targets, or optimizing trial designs?
Yeah, well, the good news is in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of progress in malaria vaccine development. These two new vaccines that target the sporozoite stage, that's the stage the mosquito injects into your skin and then into the blood, and that's fantastic, except that this parasite is a huge beast in molecular terms. A virus like COVID would have about 12 genes, a bacterium maybe hundreds of thousands, 1,000. The malaria parasite has 5,000, all of them relevant to the parasite in that they have ways of getting into our red cells, getting into the liver, multiplying furiously, and eventually, unfortunately, killing lots of people. But if you want to vaccinate against malaria, you have the problem of which of those 5,000 you're going to use, and that's been a long-standing problem. And the two new vaccines that are being used just target one of those antigens. But for the other stages of the life cycle, particularly when the parasite's in the blood, when it's most dangerous, we'd love to have a vaccine against the blood stage of infection. And that is coming along too, but it's been particularly difficult because malaria antigens are very complex. We're not always sure of their structure. It's pretty hard to work that out. And then it's even harder to present them to the immune system in a vaccine in a way that you get really strong immune responses. And we know that to protect against malaria, you need much higher levels of immunity, or antibodies usually, than you would with almost any other disease. So just for example, in COVID, 25 micrograms per mil was a good level of antibody, protected people pretty well up to 90%. In malaria, that seems to do nothing, that level of antibody. And you need about 100 micrograms or ideally 150 micrograms with these new vaccines to give you durable protection. So that technical problem is one that AI feeds into. It helps us understand better exactly what the shape of the molecule is in the parasite. It's no good having it in a different shape, even though you've made it, if it doesn't have the way of targeting the immune system that you get through natural infection. So AI came just in time. It's a very valuable tool. Lots of people are using it in malaria and for many other diseases. But there's more work to do in malaria simply because the parasite is a much bigger beast with these 5,000 genes than, say, a virus.
Amazing. Professor Hill, we are talking about AI and, genomes and, we are in, of course, because we are in 2025, but ages ago we had one instrument which is right next to you, which is a drum, and we used it in Africa to, send messages. Professor Hill, what's today your message to the next generation of African scientists working on malaria, particularly those who want to lead local vaccine R&D efforts? I mean, you are not obliged to use the drum. You can just, give the message.
Well, there are a couple of messages. The first one is right now, we have for the first time ever, this year and last year, vaccines available at large scale, and they don't work unless you put them into arms. And they work best of all in young children. We get stronger immune responses in the babies and young children than we do in older adults. And that's what the World Health Organization is strongly recommending, that children be vaccinated with these new anti-parasite vaccines for the first time, and we're sure the death rate is going to go down as a result. Just how much that will be, we'll see over the next few years, but it may well be over a 50% reduction in mortality with the tools that we have right now, not just vaccines, but also bed nets and insecticides that we've been using for years. But where we really want to go is to the stage where we actually eliminate malaria. There's only been one infectious disease in the history of mankind that we have got rid of, and that of course is smallpox, and that took quite an effort. There's been a big effort on polio. We're nearly there, not quite, there's still polio around, but malaria looks like a disease you really could eliminate if you had the right drugs, the right vaccines, and the right insecticides. And of course, once you eradicate a disease, you stop paying to control it. And today we know that just controlling malaria as we do today costs $5 billion a year. And most of that's in Africa. There are lots of other good things people could do with $5 billion. But if you could seriously in the next 10 years have a malaria elimination program, and people are designing that as I speak and planning how to do it, not only would you, at the end of that 10 years, if successful, not have to pay any more money to buy vaccines, buy drugs, buy bed nets and so all of that, so you'd save your $5 billion, which would be fantastic. We know that in countries where malaria reduces, economic activity increases. Your gross domestic product, or GDP in the country, increases, the country becomes richer, and the really interesting thing is that the health economists all agree that if you could get rid of malaria, you'd not only stop paying the bills for controlling it, the economic growth in the country would be massively greater than the amount of money you'd save on not controlling malaria. So it would be many tens, if not 100 million, 100 billion that you would be looking at saving over several years. And that would transform the economies of many African countries. Not just the health of the people, but also the productivity of people who are not impaired in their daily work, if you like, by having to deal with malaria, particularly at the height of the malaria season.
What has been the biggest advance in malaria research over the past few years?
Well, I'm pretty sure that most people would agree that now having not just the first malaria vaccine, but 2 malaria vaccines that are made inexpensively, can be produced at a huge scale, and those are being rolled out in Africa to African children in dozens of countries as we speak, and we know that they are very protective against malaria. And that's come from a lot of research over, well, more than 100 years. People have been trying to make malaria vaccines. Nothing was licensed until last year. And what we were able to do was produce a vaccine that is not only safe in the trials we've done in thousands of African children in 4 different countries, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Kenya and in Tanzania, but the data look great. The efficacy is very high, at times over 75%, which is exactly what WHO called for 10 years ago. And remember, our vaccines, or those 2, are probably something like the 80th vaccine that have gone into clinical trials at that stage of development. So it hasn't been easy, but we've got there. We think we can do even better by adding other components to the existing vaccines and use that to have overall higher efficacy, but eventually to try and get rid of this disease completely.
This feels like a condensed masterclass. But this brings us to the end of this special care episode from Dakar. A heartfelt thank you to you, Professor Adrian Hill, for sharing your deep insights and decades of experience in the fight against malaria. As we've heard today, science led by collaboration and grounded in local capacity is key to building lasting impact across Africa. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care.